taking off my CRNA hat for a moment, the idea of investing, 12 years into a professional and having them do outpatient endoscopy is like a giant waste of taxpayer dollars. That's just not a good use of resources. So MD-only care has gone down significantly. All these others, QZ has increased by 15%. Medical direction or team models has gone up by 30%. All right, everybody, we're back for another episode of the number one podcast in the anesthesia world about the rest. Randy Moore. I know. I'm known for my humility. That's what everybody tells me. Humble Joe. That's what my wife calls me. Randy Moore, one of the best thinkers in anesthesia. Always a pleasure to have you on. And Andrew Woodmancey, new to the show. Welcome, fellas. Andrew,
Welcome.
how's it going?
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've got your fancy bio here, Andrew. So why don't you get this? I'm going to read this and you can tell us who you really are. Currently, you're the managing director of Anesthesia Operations Consultants, healthcare consulting firm. You've got a team of 14. You are only focused in anesthesia, and you are the former director of anesthesia consulting at Surgical Directions, the big firm out of, I think they're in the Northeast or the Midwest, Surgical Directions, Andrew. But just why don't you tell the audience who you are, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So hi, Andrew Woodmancey, Managing Director of Anesthesia Operations Consultants. We focus specifically in anesthesia. So most of our clients are on the hospital side. We do support some groups as well, but really try to take a holistic view of anesthesia and come with suggestions for how groups and hospitals could partner together to help with operations from peri-op, how can they work together to help improve the reimbursement for the group and help lower the subsidization for the facility. Before starting and getting into consulting, I also spent 10 years working for Team Health and Mednex as well. So thanks for having us, Joe.
Yeah, you bet. What did you do for Team Health and Mednex?
So I worked in a variety of areas. I started in quality actually for about a year, then bounced around as the helped develop some of the original analytics
on the analysis side.
On the analysis side, as well as helped with business development for Team Health, and then was an internal consultant for Mednex.
Okay, cool. This past month, VMG, which is one of the largest healthcare consulting companies in the country, do a lot of fair market value evaluations. So for any anesthesiologists and CRNAs listening, if you're complaining about why you can't get a larger subsidy, it's probably VMG's fault. All right, they did not authorize that quote, but they did come out with a really compelling report, which has been cited numerous times now in Becker's. Let's go over some of the findings, then we'll get some feedback here. This was from a survey done last year, and they're circulating this amongst their valuation clients. The most prominent financial challenges expected for 2026 for surgery center leaders. And for those listening, for those who cannot see on the screen, at the very top of the charts is anesthesia coverage and costs. And this is a theme. I went through the whole report. This is the theme that we're seeing everywhere. Operational strategies. The top 3 most frequently selected anticipated operational bundles are number 1, expenses, right? And then number 2, securing anesthesia coverage and the associated costs. And depending on how you look at that data, that's really the same thing, because they're only concerned because they're having to pay. And then one more before we start getting some feedback here. Trending topics, anticipated anesthesia models in 2026. Number 1, by a fairly wide margin, independent contractor with stipend, 44%, without stipend, 36%, and then a small, very small part is employment and joint venture. So with all that being said, we'll start with you, Mr. Moore, Dr. Moore, depending on the context. What are your thoughts here? What are you seeing out there with all the surgery centers? All the surgery centers are listening now, and if North Star is willing to commit to absolutely subsidy-free surgery center care in 2026, now's the time.
Oh, it's interesting that I was looking at that. So are you telling me that 36% of ASC administrators anticipate having zero subsidy on anesthesia in the future? Is that what that's what the survey said? Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to flip that the other way around, that means 65% of them do. And I imagine that 36% probably includes the pain shops who are, doing 30 cases in one lineup, and or the GI guys who are doing, just cranking out cases with their illegal company model setup, right? So, they're not paying a subsidy when they're referring to themselves.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing, right? Like, I do agree with you, Joe, that, a lot of that is probably your quick turning facilities, right? Like your GI is not going to be subsidized and be running a profit mostly for anesthesia. Ophthalmology, if done correctly without cataracts in the middle of cases, could be done profitably if consolidated correctly, as well as, if you have a high commercial orthopedic center as well. And then obviously, as I'm sure both of you are addressing, right? Is your group leveraging IDR and the type of model that you're doing in the surgery center as well? So, but yeah, I do
indeed.
I do kind of struggle with the same things you guys do, right? As a consultant, I try to stay away from advising surgery centers too much, just because they have a hard time wrapping their head around the fact that anesthesia is not a eat what you kill industry, and they usually have a hard time understanding why they should be subsidizing services as well.
Which is totally understandable. If we zoom out, if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, it would be, like 90%, 90+% of ASCs had no subsidy directionally. And then, the supply demand imbalance of CRNAs and anesthesiologists hits, COVID hits, and, the reimbursement headwinds are only getting stronger. And it went from a largely unsubsidized business to a almost completely subsidized business, almost overnight. And so as we look at North Star, this has had a really interesting impact on our current business. So our legacy contracts that we've had with some ASCs, and then a lot of inbound business. And a lot of the inbound business is ASC administrators waking up and finding out that they're going to have to pay a stipend, a subsidy for the first time, and they don't like that. And so there's a lot of contract churn that's happening in the ASC space, some of which makes sense, and some of it is just the subsidy shock that's associated with how the economics in anesthesia have plays out. And interestingly, it's like when I came into North Star in the fall, in September of 2021, and that was obviously deep within.
That was right in the thick of it.
Yeah. And we were navigating through significant growth. And that growth, what was propelling that growth was, the COVID-related disruptions hitting with the supply-demand issues, and there's a lot of hospitals looking for alternative anesthesia providers. And then that started to slow down and settle down. And then about 18 months later, the ASC market popped in a real way. And again, the economics are driving this in a very real way.
We saw the same thing, right? Around COVID. COVID was like this weird moment, and everything was changing, and then it resettled down, which is probably a good segue from surgery centers to the overall trend of these models, right? And I think this is, for those looking on the screen, we see that CRNA-involved cases are going up steadily year over year. Something in Florida, for instance, from 2010, Andrew, I know you're in Florida, from 2010 to 2024, this is CMS data, CRNA-involved cases went from 70% to about 90%. And just to illustrate the differences between East and West, this is probably a good data set here. 2010, CRNA-involved cases were 1 in 4, 24%. Now we're trending towards 50%, so almost doubled in about 14 years. And there's a little blip here, which, being very familiar with the data, I can speak to this a little bit. This little blip correlated with COVID. Randy, you were just talking about this. And this is where QZ just went through the roof. Right, a lot of anesthesiologists step back from clinical care, and then it went back down a little bit. The overall trend is up, but you see those differences.
In terms of the opt-outs, I think the last state to opt out before COVID was in 2013. But during COVID, they had a temporary lift, right, of allowing you to opt out in any state. And really, there was a flurry of states that had opted out after that. I think North Carolina, you guys are probably a little more tied into specifically to that. I know I'm working
you think we're biased? Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, I'm working in Colorado as well, and they had a rural healthcare exception that has recently been, moved to the entire state as well. So I think that's really the big piece of this, but also just the universal acceptance of the safeness of practice, not only of independent practice, but also 5 and 6 to 1 and beyond models as well.
Randy, what are your thoughts seeing this trend towards CRNA-involved? And just for the listeners, this is bundling QZ. We'll get to breaking out QZ and medical direction, but this is bundling QZ and medical direction. Randy, thoughts?
Yeah, this has been the trend for many years now, which is what I often refer to as kind of modernizing the care team model, which is, if you don't have CRNAs, you're looking to bring CRNAs into the model usually for the obvious financial and operational reasons. And if you say you have an anesthesia care team model, there's an increased interest in saying, well, hey, how can we move from a typical 1 to 3, 1 to 4 to more of like a zone coverage, and using the QZ billing modifier to help facilitate that. And if you look at the data, I mean, I saw data where the utilization of QZ modifier, and for those of your listeners or who may not be super familiar with some of the inside baseball lingo we're using here, just think of QZ modifier as a billing modifier that's used to bill exclusively under the CRNA versus a CRNA versus physician model. So it's a signal that there's an increased utilization of CRNAs. Either they've been added to a model, or the practice model at the site has moved from a traditional 1 to 3, 1 to 4 to something different, right? And so you see this play out in a very real way, which there is just a appetite for bringing CRNAs in, and there's an appetite for reevaluating anesthesia care team models and trying to find a more kind of economically sustainable approach.
What are you guys seeing pushback? Because Andrew, you mentioned 1 to 6, and I'm going to have thoughts here too. But are you seeing pushback when, hey, we're at 1 to, and look, depending on the compensation, 1 to 4 is really the only way to be even remotely close, at least in my models, to economic efficiency. And it's not easy to do. You get to 1 to 5, you get to 1 to 6, and then it's like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. But a lot of anesthesiologists, trying to characterize their position, and we'll have them on the show as well. But a lot of anesthesiologists get really uncomfortable with that 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 7 model. What are you guys seeing out there? As we see a world in which, look, Florida, 9 in 10 cases are done by a CRNA. That means an anesthesiologist is floating or some way, and it might be a solo model as well. But what are you guys hearing out there, Randy?
I mean, it's a change management problem. So it's like we're all kind of a victim of our previous experiences and perspective. So if I was an anesthesiologist and I trained in a 1 to 3 model, and then I practiced in a 1 to 3, 1 to 4 model, then someone comes in and says, hey, now we're gonna move to a zone coverage model where now it's 1 to 6, 1 to 7. I would probably have concerns if I was that anesthesiologist,
sure,
without understanding that when you move from that 1 to 4 model to a 1 to 6 model, the expectations of your involvement change too. And so that is and that's hard, because if you've been doing, you're thinking TEFRA, which are the 7 requirements that you need to do to meet medical direction, that becomes, inculcated in your brain. Now you're saying, actually, that's not that important. Your role is going to change from being a medically directing physician to being more of a kind of perioperative consultant of some kind, right? And a facilitator of throughput. So that requires a lot of thoughtful communication and change management with the anesthesiologist, also with the CRNAs, and with the surgeons and the administrators. And so where I see these issues where the anesthesiologists get super concerned, they're concerned because they think they have to do everything they're supposed to be doing in a medically directed model, but just with more rooms to quote unquote direct or supervise. And so that's a failure often of change management and communication. And once you help them understand, well, your role is going to fundamentally change, but it's actually going to be better for you, then often you see some success in the adoption of those models.
Andrew, I know you've got some really illustrious MDs that you're working with. I'm sure you work with them, people who are employed by the hospital or local to the area. What are you seeing on this issue? This is a recurring theme. It comes up in some form or another, and on every show. What are you seeing out there as far as this zone model, collaborative model, light supervision model?
Yeah, so I think Randy nailed it in terms of how it's working on the physician perspective of taking on that. I think what we're also starting to see, though, is a willingness from facilities as well to adapt this model because of the efficiencies they gain, right? Like the first AM start is no longer being adjusted because the physician needs to be there at the beginning of the case, right? So it's helping them as hospitals are becoming more focused on throughput. And working through that, they're liking this, even if they stay at 4-1 and just go to supervision, and allowing the physician not to have to document the 7 steps. And like Randy said, being more of a perioperative consultant and being able to focus on the cases that may be a little higher acuity is also yielding a lot of value for the facility as well. And I think, just not to dissect too far away, I think it's a shame that, billing constructs are keeping us from moving away from what may be most efficient for hospitals and healthcare systems across the board.
Let's use the really, really cliche business term. Let's double click on that idea. This slide is based on modifiers, right? So it gives us a very rough approximation. And this confirms what you're seeing in the other slide. CRNAs are involved in the majority of cases. MD only care, solo care. I think the idea of, taking off my CRNA hat for a moment, the idea of investing, 12 years into a professional and having them do outpatient endoscopy is like a giant waste of taxpayer dollars. That's just not a good use of resources. So MD only care has gone down significantly. All these others, QZ has increased by 15%. Medical direction or team models has gone up by 30%. But what are you talking about with this idea around modifiers?
Yeah, I think the construct of modifiers, right? And I think we had talked about this a bit offline. I think most of the modifiers, if I remember correctly, was speaking, one of my physician partners were instituted in 2006, 2007, right? We live in a different world, right? There's a whole piece of this that's missing where it's, you're CRNA only. Does that include supervision, right? Where you're working in the zone model, like Randy alluded to, because that's also being caught by the QZ modifier, right? So, and a complete adjustment to the system, I think, is needed to be able to capture what is and isn't best for hospitals and the industry as a whole, right? And there are other things to consider, right? Like, I know there's always the CRNA versus CAA construct, right? But currently you can't do a zone model with CAAs, even if you're doing 4-1, right? So by instituting CAAs into your practice, you're either going to have to break medical direction, or you're not going to be as efficient as you can be for the OR, which I think is a waste of resources, in my opinion.
You have now been disinvited from the Quad A conference. You will not be speaking at the American Academy of Anesthesiologist Assistants. I mean, but somebody asked me what I think of AAs, and I was like, they're not very helpful to us, because even if we're running a 4-1, we're probably not billing at medical direction, right? It's probably because it's a high acuity place, and it's just good to have all that mix of professionals there.
But I think the question becomes, as the profession becomes older, right? And you have people that are like CAAs that are, 10, 15, 20 years into practice. Why do they have to have a physician looking over their shoulder for every item? And, I think it's just, potentially a bigger question.
I know we talked about having colleagues of yours on, but when you bring this up, what are your anesthesiologists saying about that? Because that's not the party line, right? I mean, that's not the, I put up something on TikTok or Instagram just yesterday, and I basically said, I'm trying to summarize my thoughts. I basically said, look, supervision is going to continue to get pulled back, right, from a government point of view. That doesn't really change things on the ground unless it needs to change things on the ground. And people are like, that's totally unsafe. Line up the body bags, right? We've heard that for a million years. What are your anesthesiologists saying?
I mean, most of my anesthesiologists are regional medical directors, right? So they're going to be thinking the same as like a Randy's colleague, right? They're not only doing inner city hospitals, right? They're also doing rural hospitals. So they're seeing most of this, and they understand what it takes from the industry perspective. So their thought process is not the same as what you would see from the ASA and some of what their opinions are. They don't completely disalign with them. There's some things they agree with, obviously.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Something they do great.
But in terms of business owners, I think that most of them, and it's not just my partners, there's also people that own anesthesia businesses like you, Joe. They have a differing opinion on medical direction. Just put it that way.
I think and I've said this before on the show, so bear with me. But the ASA's fundamental position is that medical direction is the gold standard, right? And when that's not like it wouldn't be so bad there, but then it goes further to effectively say that CRNAs and AAs are effectively scribes, for lack of a better term. That's the fundamental problem, right? It's always going to set up this tension, and it's an economic, like, if this model was here, our economic future would be guaranteed forever and ever. And it's just not reality, and it sets up this fundamental tension. I don't meet a lot of CRNAs who truly want to practice solo 100% of the time. They just don't, right? Most of us like daytime work, or, it's like, that's not the point, but nobody likes, the thumb being pressed down on them. And that's where all the tension comes from. So I think if they moved away from that position, this would all just get a lot easier. The other aspect, which in our practice, we've had to, talk through quite a bit, especially for people coming from, your heavy Northeastern type practices, is what does that supervision actually look like and how is it defined? Every surgery center, every facility we go into, I say, how you're defining supervision. They say we don't define it at all. Of course, that just leaves it open to the government and or plaintiff lawyers to decide, right? And in other parts of the service sector industry, supervision can be ultra high level, like I'm supervising you on an annual basis, or I'm, really controlling what you do. I'm controlling your practice. And when we back that, you can keep some sort of oversight. All professionals have oversight in some form or another. It's just a matter of measuring that locally. And I think that's often what gets missed.
Right. But that's a big problem. No one's raising their hand to take on, right? That goes back to the fact that we haven't changed the construct in, 20 years, right? Like, people don't want to challenge the system for whatever reason, which doesn't make any sense to me as an economics
I'm in my 40s.
major.
I want to change stuff.
Well, it's interesting. So I think what we're seeing here, like there's a few threads to pull, but the thing that I think connects all of those is what is trying to happen, and is that the healthcare writ large, but I guess the anesthesia ecosystem specifically is trying to move in a direction where they have economically sustainable practice models. And there's different permutations of this. But what you're seeing is the signal of QZ utilization, the signal of CRNA utilization, where you're seeing the all physician practices significantly decrease over time. All of that is a byproduct of the hard economics that are occurring relative to providing anesthesia services in a highly subsidized business. And so if you're on the wrong side of that, so if you are saying what is happening shouldn't happen, then you're probably not effectively advocating for your constituency. So the zero sum, it has to be this one specific construct. And I'm talking about like the ASA's position here is, again, from completely apolitical perspective, the ASA's position here is it's almost laughable in that it doesn't reflect what's actually happening in the macro and the micro in anesthesia. And I think they're going to have to adapt, I guess, to understanding where anesthesia is going, which still is an awesome opportunity for anesthesiologists. I mean, there's no world in which we would be talking about artificially limiting the number of anesthesiologists that come into the workplace or not using anesthesiologists. There's more than enough work. But what I think, if I were the ASA or anyone who really cares about this stuff, I would be thinking about how do I position myself and my workforce to adapt to what is happening because of the tidal wave of economics that are driving practice model changes.
Tidal wave is the right word.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Tidal wave is it's a tsunami. And so I would like to take this moment to officially invite Dr. Patrick Guillaume, MD, FASA, to the podcast. Next episode, he's the president of the ASA. He can come on and weigh in and share his perspective. But I think I was actually going back and forth with some of the anesthesiologists in our group on some of these issues. And what has occurred to me is twofold, which is, if you are relying on the United States government to ensure your value in the marketplace, that's not a good bet, right? The other part is people pay a lot of money to anesthesiologists. And this probably will not be popular in CRNA world, but it's just economics. People pay a lot of money to anesthesiologists because they find value in their service. And that's it, right? Like all this whole, and I know you guys are not on Instagram as much as I am, or TikTok, but there's this whole every third post is, we did all this schooling so we should get paid more. There's dentists on there. We did all this schooling so we should get paid more. And I just feel like screaming into the void, guys, your amount of schooling doesn't really matter. It only matters that you're solving the surgeon's problem. And that's it. And if the moment that surgeons can do it without us, they definitely will, right? Because they're just taking risk away. Anyway, I digress. Any other thoughts on these billing trends before we move on to the next topic?
The only thing I would throw out,
Yeah, please.
This may be out of scope of the conversation, is like all this QZ billing conversation that we've had and the trends, which are undeniable. The one thing that is a bogey, and it's not theoretical, it's real, is the reimbursement relative to QZ threats coming from the commercial payers. And that can, if you sit down and you do the math in certain situations, a 15% or 20% delta between what you're going to pay a CRNA and a QZ model, or in some cases, even a medically directed model, they're going to pay CRNAs less. That changes sometimes the outcomes of what models should look like. And I think some people are really surprised by that. And especially in a situation where you have CRNAs, they're getting 15% or more less reimbursement in a QZ model, and 30% or 50% of those CRNAs are locum tenens. Then the math starts to swing back towards actually the medical direction model is the smartest thing to do financially.
Yes, that is true. Locum CRNAs just blow the whole model up. I mean, that's brutal. Right.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, what are you seeing, Andrew, there? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, though, that the number one problem, right, and where everyone is just missing the ball on the ASA and the AANA side, and not to kind of point fingers at either one, right, is this is like a classic divide and conquer. The real problem we're having is right now as an industry is with insurance companies and regulations, right? And, if there were a unified front, I think that would be better for everybody, right? Like, people are talking about, how do I fight for money for myself? And what they don't realize is that the hardest part to making that argument with a hospital is the fact that they're subsidizing your services. If there was a way that anesthesiologists and CRNAs could work together to fight insurance companies and lower that subsidization, I'm sure people would be more than happy to pay a little more, right? I mean, and that's kind of the number one problem in this industry, in my opinion. Right, because there's no stopping the low supply situation in the short run.
Correct. Yeah, so Randy knows this. Andrew, you may not. I'm starting on the ANA board in 2 months or something like that, and I don't know if I'll have a chance to speak with the illustrious Dr. Guillaume. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but I try to think about, like, where's the very narrow window of success, and maybe it's in the fact that maybe the United States government shouldn't have anything to do with anesthesia models. And maybe that's where we can unite. I'm serious. Like, why are we letting the government decide these things? This is crazy. I know they feel like, I think obviously they feel like it protects them, but I don't think it does. Because I don't think the problem can be solved without them. And as much as
so I am not a huge deregulate everything libertarian kind
of person.
All right,
I know you're a member of the DSA. It's all right.
And so there's definitely a role and room for regulation, especially if it's
for sure.
Like, hey, protecting patient safety, preventing waste, fraud, and abuse.
Definitely.
Sure. But if you look at, and the regulations I think you're referencing, and there's obviously other regulations, and I happen to think that healthcare is actually over-regulated in some areas, is when the regulation gets in the way of what needs to happen from a common sense perspective, then we need to look at the regulation. And the opt-out is a kind of a good example of where there seems to be a mountain of evidence that this is a regulation that doesn't serve anyone's need, at least from a practical patient safety, financial operation perspective. And I think that's an area where I could definitely get on board from a deregulation perspective.
Just yesterday, the state of Vermont, which is now the 26th state plus Guam, so majority of jurisdictions easily now have removed physician supervision. But yeah, talking about, this is what no anesthesia podcast talks about, but talking about the role of government. And obviously, scope of practice is regulated at the state level. Even that, this is outside of broad strokes, I am somewhat skeptical that 100 elected representatives know enough to effectively regulate scope of practice. And largely they turf it to Board of Nursing or Board of Medicine. But I mean, these things are defined in statute typically, right? So that's the legislature. And I'm not I'm not a diehard Republican. I'm a political independent. But on this issue specifically, trying to talk to Lipton is just crazy town. Anyway, so back to the news. So 26 state cuts physician supervision. This was from 5 hours ago. I just put this up. You guys are both familiar with this. This is Medicare Part A. So just for those listening, Medicare Part A reimburses hospitals. That is the federal government's reimbursement of hospitals. In those regulations, it requires a physician, which can be a surgeon or an anesthesiologist, to supervise CRNA services. And it has failed or it has declined to define what level of supervision that is. This is one federal regulation that is within the purview of governors to pull back. So it's unusual in this sense. What the impact of practice is a topic of debate in and of itself. But Andrew, let's start with you. What are your thoughts? What are you hearing about this? Did you get text message yesterday about this, or was it no news?
There was no news. Not on my front, honestly. I haven't worked in Vermont, so it's not a state I have much experience in. But obviously, I'm a huge fan of allowing free market and opting out. And I think there's a space for independent practice. So I'm a huge fan of this, and hopefully we get a couple more. I know Florida was right on the doorstep there. Hopefully we could get that through as well. So
Andrew, you just keep getting disinvited from conferences, man. You're not going to get invited to the ASA by saying
okay.
that. Randy, any thoughts?
For those of our listeners who aren't super familiar with this is kind of the bastard stepchild of what was trying to happen during the Bush administration, or prior to the Bush administration, in the 11th hour of the Clinton administration. They had removed this requirement in Medicare conditions of payment. And then when Bush came in, he halted all of the rulemaking that had not been fully promulgated, and then ended up with this kind of negotiated agreement where they were going to default to the states. So here we are, many years later, 26 states have successfully opted out and stayed opted out. And so, it's an interesting experiment. The question I would ask is, how does this impact access to care? What data do we have with it? How does this impact cost of care? And how does this impact quality of care? And I think there's a lot of spirited debate around whether the opt-out is, practically changing practice models, whether it's changing economics or it's changing unfavorably patient care. And you can debate that. There's back and forth between the usual suspects on that. I tend to see this as a potentially helpful tool in managing the perception barriers associated with changing practice models, right? From, what we talked about, 1 to 3 medical direction to 1 to 6 zone coverage, those kinds of things. Or even in the ASC, we see a lot of ASCs that are either have moved to all CRNA or thinking about it. And so, I think about this as from a practical perspective, you can have an all CRNA model, you can have a zone coverage 1 to 6 model in a state that's not opted out. This helps make the conversation a little bit easier. And it's a signal hey, even the state, the governor of the state and, the federal government have created a mechanism by which you can remove this requirement of physician supervision for, and so what the practical implications are, I don't actually know. How is this impacting the big 3 things that we care about: access, cost, and quality of care?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think, when I see these regulations being pulled back, I just ask myself, what are the local leaders going to do about it now? And this is what I posted yesterday on Instagram. If I were a surgeon, GI doctor, cardiologist, or what have you, I would or an anesthesiologist leading a department, I would be immediately sending an email to my compliance department and saying, how can we update our policies and procedures to remove any perceptions of liability around this supervision rule? Because again, from my previous statement, most facilities don't have this defined, right? So now that this is not in place, why have it at all? And you can still, like we've talked about, there's a fundamental disconnect with a lot of anesthesia leaders because they don't understand the regulatory environment and the clinical environment are 2 different things, right? So you can still maintain oversight, even tight oversight, at the local level if that's what you need to do, with the talent that you have, right? And that's not unheard of. But you don't need to keep it in there just because, right? Because ultimately, if you have it there and you're not doing it, that creates a bigger problem. In Arizona, obviously, I know that state well. We have 1, 2, 3 major groups. I'll say one of them, and I won't say the other one because they're my competitors, and I don't want them getting any press. Sorry, Justin, if you're listening. Justin's one of the owners there. He's a good buddy of mine. So there's three major groups, right? So guide anesthesia, we are once a Arizona name. There's Summit, and then there's GAS. And all taken, these groups probably have about they probably have about 50+% of the Phoenix market, and probably 1/3, depending on how you cut the data, of the entire state. And when you have groups like that, that really changes things. And that's probably the best example I know of there was an, opt-out came into place, and then those groups, and they all have anesthesiologists. I'm talking about myself in the third person here. They all have anesthesiologists as well. And I think that's what what gets lost in the shuffle, right? It's like anesthesiologists don't go away in this mix. That seems to be the theme of this episode, is like the changes that are happening with all these anesthesia models. I anticipate this will keep going, right? I think we're going to see 27, 28, maybe a national opt-out in the future, just because it doesn't do a lot. Safety is largely a mechanism of local practitioners, right? There's no amount of government regulation that's going to prevent a bad actor, right, or an incompetent person. That's my sense of it, is let the local practitioners decide what their scope of practice should be. Does that sound right?
No, yeah.
I'm waiting for my invitation to a conference for speaking. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, I do kind of agree with Randy. You needed some guardrails, but I think they should be very high level, right? And, allow the local group to decide what is and isn't safe in their opinion, as long as it's not something ridiculous, right? Like, as long as if someone has taken the time to get the license that we are nationally accepting for doing care, that should be fine, in my opinion. People should be able to work to top of license anywhere throughout the country.
So, it's interesting. I'm just going to drop one more thought as we're contemplating things. One, I keep thinking about this word competency in the sense of, how pilots get licensed? Like they get licensed per, this is my layman's version, per plane, right? So rather than, hey, you're an MD, you can do all of these things. You're a CRNA, you can do all of these things, which is really a bad way to do it, because we know, the differential between professionals can be massive. Right, you have some CRNAs who only do GI. You have some CRNAs who are brilliant and they're doing all this fancy stuff that I don't personally do. And if we went to a world where it's like, no, you are certified for outpatient anesthesia, you are certified for this segment of regional, this level of autonomy, and over your career, you just increase that. We kind of do it de facto because local people figure it out. That would be a much better way to do it, I think, than a national certification that just, lives on in perpetuity. But I digress.
I think that's a great point, by the way. I do. It does exist somewhat on the anesthesiologist side for PED certification, right? Trauma, cardiac. I know those things exist.
It does, but it doesn't.
CRNA,
It doesn't prevent them.
Right.
Right. That's the thing. Like, you're not like, I could go do, if I can get my delineation privileges, which is super broad, right? And then ultimately it's going to be whoever runs the board. And same thing with anesthesiologists, right? I mean, they get their DOP, it's super broad. It doesn't prevent them from doing anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Andrew. I'm sorry. You finish your point.
No. I think I agree, though. I do agree that, additional steps gives people stuff to work for, right? And adds a level of comfort across the board. And I do think that would be a good move as well, right? Because, we've talked about this in the past, right? Like, part of the angst with the QZ is like, are we going to let a student practice independently? And I think most people, think that may be a little controversial, right? But if there was a step to say, hey, 5 years in, you could take another test and then you could practice independently, that may change the conversation completely.
That has actually been suggested multiple times. I've seen that a lot over the years. And actually that competency idea, when we first did our statute change, where we actually have physician direction in Arizona. I don't know if you guys know this. So we're required to have the direction of a physician, but we have the surgeon and physician immunity language. So it's this weird legal state where you have direction, but nobody knows what that means. But we know you can't be liable, so you can't be supervising, so we opted out. When we were having that conversation, a surgeon who was very practical, not unlike the people on this call, basically said, look, I had an all CRNA model for many, many years. Then I went into a higher acuity practice, and we had an anesthesiologist because, these patients were sick as all get out and blah, blah, blah. And that's not to say CRNAs don't do, gosh, it's going to be quoted somewhere. CRNAs definitely do. There's sick people everywhere, right? But, based on the local CRNAs, they wanted to add different professionals, and that's fine. But he was the one who brought it up. The license doesn't matter as much as the competency. What you did 15 years ago, a training program that you did 15 years ago, isn't particularly relevant if you're not competent today. And to your point, Randy, earlier, the competencies that the market will require I think, humbly, of physician anesthesiologists is likely to change. And that's probably a good segue to our next phase here. I said physician anesthesiologists out of habit, just because I do see that more and more. So this made some news in the interprofessional circles. You guys probably didn't care about it very much, but we're going to get your thoughts anyway. The day before, I'm going to give a little bit longer of a background here, just because this is a big issue. The ANA Board of Directors withdrew a trademark. And follow along with me here. They withdrew a trademark for the name American Association of Nurse Anesthesiologists. Now, you may be thinking, if you're listening to the show, I don't know of a group called the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiologists, and that's because that name is not in use. That name doesn't exist. So they being the ANA, thought about it because of a conversation I'll just very briefly review. They filed the trademark. It's not in use. They withdrew it. Subsequent to that withdrawal, the ASA was opposing that trademark. The ASA went on all the media channels, the LinkedIns, the Instagrams, the Facebooks, and said this is a decisive victory for their members. And look, I understand they're trying to claim a win. You know, membership organizations are tough to run. I'm not sure I would characterize it as a decisive victory, but I'm just going to give a little bit of background and then get reaction here. So first, this issue stems back to industry research. This was leaked on the internet around 2017, and I remember all this going down. So this is research from the ASA from 2013. They basically found that a minority of voters recognize anesthesiologists as physicians. The majority didn't know or thought they were something else. Right. So that kind of shook the foundations, I think, of the American Society of Anesthesiologists in terms of identity. Right. Subsequently, they began to call themselves physician anesthesiologists. In the same industry research that they commissioned from a firm out of Chicago, and this kind of lit the world on fire a little bit during this time, they did research on how to make sure that CRNAs were perceived to be less essential. And the language they used, if you're not seeing it on the screen, is this is how we want them to be perceived, which indicates some level of intent to make sure that CRNAs are perceived as less essential and were perceived as more essential. Fast forward 13 years or so, now they've been physician anesthesiologists for many years. The AANA, and I don't have anything on the screen for this, but the AANA effectively said, look, I'm trying to characterize accurately here. We recognize the confusion out there. There's dentist anesthesiologists. There's CAAs, anesthesiologist assistants, calling themselves anesthetists. So physician anesthesiologists still in use today. The American Association of Nurse Anesthetists recognized this term as a complementary term, nurse anesthesiologist. I remember all of this going down. Many CRNAs were really against this idea because they're very proud of their title. However, I think when they saw that the ASA was doing research on how to make them less essential in the marketplace, they saw that the new anesthetist campaign was very popular at that time from the Quad A, from the AAs. That is, all of a sudden we have to do something, right? So that is the entire background. I have some things to say about this because I remember all this going down well. Randy, we don't talk about this a lot, but you were the CEO of the AANA at this time. I believe you referred to this controversy as Brexit at the time.
I am clever. I don't remember saying that, but I'll take it. I mean, this is I definitely have some PTSD from all of this. So,
oh man, this was a big deal. This was a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the bigger things that as CEO of the AANA, I had to navigate around multiple internal stakeholders on this issue,
man.
right?
Yeah.
So, I guess zoom out.
Did you have a therapy bill? Did the ANA cover your therapy bills after all this? This was intense. I remember it.
Yeah, the litigation's still playing out. Yeah. But there is I think this is a interesting, kind of human problem, which is a lot of what drives human emotion is related to your identity and how you think of yourself and how you're referred in certain situations by certain people. And so this is you see this this is not uniquely anesthesia. There's other healthcare related conversations around should PAs be
physician
associates or physician assistants, and so there's a lot about this that's wrapped up in identity that it's hard to decouple from the psychology versus the practical stuff, right? So I have seen this, and this is where I personally see this as a massive distraction to what is actually important to the average day CRNA an anesthesiologist who gives zero shits. 99.9% of CRNAs and anesthesiologists give zero shits about this. And this seems a lot to me like political theater, right? So the ASA is, they're now spiking the football. Look how we have caused the AANA to stand down. And now the AANA, who's made a very practical and defensible decision here, the AANA's decision to not throw more money at this through litigation is a very good decision as a fiduciary for the profession and for the organization. And the ASA is going to gloat a little bit about it. And all the while, the key stakeholders, the legislators, regulators, administrators in hospitals, health systems, and ASCs, patients could not care less about any of all of this political theater. And I think it was a really smart decision by the AANA to say, you know what? I don't want to spend any more money on this because 99% of the people who care in the world don't give a shit. And the ASA can continue to say that they did, they've accomplished something. None of their members care. 99% of their members don't care either. And so what I've seen is like a lot of like emotion around this in a way that doesn't, really mean anything to what CRNAs and anesthesiologists care about.
I completely agree. I am not a physician or a CRNA, but I would find it insulting that they're using our donations to spend time on this versus the things that actually affect the industry. So that would be my opinion of it. I understand there's other political things involved that I may not understand as an actual clinician, but I do agree. I think it is a waste of both parties' time.
I think that you're correct to a degree. To some degree, perception drives behavior. I never use the term nurse anesthesiologist initially. I don't walk around saying I'm a nurse anesthesiologist. I say, I'm Joe Rodriguez. I'm a CRNA. I pronounce it very clearly. So if there's questions around that term, people can ask. I don't say nurse anesthetist because one, it's hard to say, and two, people don't generally know what the term anesthetist means. They think I'm doing their nails or something like that. I say, hey, I'm Joe Rodriguez. I'm a CRNA. I'll be doing your anesthesia today. And I go into the patient interview, right? Now, for the savvy or the curious, some will say, what does that mean? And I'll say, it's certified registered nurse anesthetist. And if there's a further contextual conversation to have, I'll talk about different types of anesthesiologists. That's not a common thing, but it definitely happens from time to time. So I think it's a helpful tool, especially in the context of if there's a physician anesthesiologist, there's a dentist anesthesiologist, there's a nurse anesthesiologist. That just makes sense, right, from a kind of a lexicon point of view. But I think the goal is to be clear that there are physicians involved in this specialty, that there are CRNAs who are involved in this specialty, and there's other professions as well. Those are the two main ones. And I think from an internal point of view, it's important to recognize that the specialty of anesthesia is one that is held by multiple professions. And that is uncomfortable for some in the industry. After that, I don't think we need to talk about it a lot, right? But I think it was such an inflammatory issue. It just became such a huge issue for such a long time. I don't like policing speech, right? I think if you're being clear that you're a member of the nursing profession, that you offer certain expertise, that is fine. That is good, in fact. Yeah, like you said, Randy, at the top of your comments, you said, hey, identity is important. And that's where all of this comes from, right? But it doesn't solve economic issues. It solves internal issues. I do think for some CRNAs, there is, hey, I'm very comfortable effectively operating as an AA, and that's fine. They can. But there's a large segment of CRNAs who are trying to operate at a high level and feel consistent pushback. And for that segment, and you call it 40%, and maybe even upwards of 60% on how they feel. That's where that matters. And I don't think we have to do anything else, though. I think it's fine just as it is. That is my take on it. I know that's not like a super popular one amongst the business people, but yeah, I don't know. I'm on both sides of this. You know what I mean? I didn't come up at Guide either. No one texted me right away and say, did you hear that we won or lost the trademark? I was like, no, just business as usual.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares. and that's like the challenge with this stuff is that when you get to the board of directors of the AANA or ASA, you've now entered into an echo chamber. And what seems like a big deal because someone is running their mouth on Facebook and there's 4 other people who are joining in, and then all of a sudden the board starts to get focused on this stuff, is if you like really think about it and think it through, is like this is absolutely meaningless conversation. And so the risk here is, like any organization, any leadership team, is, are we doing the things here as an organization that mean the most to our members? And and that is like driving the economic value of anesthesia relative to anesthesiologists, if you're thinking about this from an anesthesiologist perspective, or from a CRNA perspective. And I tend to filter things through that. And if there's not a practical reason why something's going to impact, then I don't really have a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, there's not a lot of, I think it was reasonable for members to do something about being mischaracterized in the market. When you see one of the largest and oldest and most largest politically funded organizations in the country trying to figure out how to make you less essential, I think it's okay to respond to that, right? Like at kind of a philosophical level, because thoughts drive feelings, which drives actions, which drives outcomes.
Let me push back real quick.
Yeah.
We started this conversation with you showing data how the market is moving towards CRNA adoption, right? So you see the utilization of QZ, you see the introduction of CRNAs into models which were all physician. There's nothing in the data that indicates that CRNAs have been compromised from a market share perspective. In fact, the data demonstrates the exact opposite. So as we think about these, what I consider kind of the political theater stuff that permeates certain aspects of both organizations, I kind of filter it through, well, CRNA market share has only gone up. QZ adoption has doubled since 2010, which is a very good signal of CRNA utilization, independent or in a zone coverage model. And I'm not sure how any organization spending a bunch of money on referring to themselves in a way that they haven't in the past changes that. And I don't feel like, because the ASA has spent an obscene amount of money on PR that no one listens to, and that you or we or as an organization needs to spin up a bunch of activity and deprioritize the things that matter the most in order to focus on something that actually doesn't drive CRNA market share.
I can steel man your argument, right? It doesn't drive value for the people that want our services, in the sense of, it doesn't solve patient problems, it doesn't solve surgeon problems, it doesn't solve facility problems. I understand that point of view. It's very utilitarian. What I would add on to that, and Andrew will come to you with this, what I would add on to it is, at some point, you have to have an operating framework or a philosophy of who you are. And I do not advise CRNAs to take like an ultra aggressive, kind of F other people, right? Like, no, let's just advocate for a world in which we are professionals. We're professionals who offer services. There's, just like any other professional, there's reasonable oversight in that world. And to some degree, I think the way we talk about ourselves influences the decisions that we make. And that's a really high level thought. But I don't think it's good for, CRNAs to generally accept permanent second-class citizen status. And I know the anesthesiologists in our group, and I think broadly speaking, would say, well, that's not what we're going for, right? But again, when a very well-funded organization does those sorts of things, it makes you think. It's like, oh, wow, how is that going to play out in 10 years? So I see both points of view. I get it. It doesn't create value. And again, all I would say is that it's fine where it is. Don't police speech. Be accurate with your words, and then get back to solving problems, because that's what drives the economy, right? No one gets paid because of their title. They get paid for solving problems. So it's a different view, obviously. Andrew, go ahead. Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would say that the onus is on both professions to, if you go back 10 years ago when all this started, right? Like, there was less need for them to push back on some of the political portions of this, or maybe a little further back. But now both parties wasting their time focusing on these things is kind of a disjustice to themselves as well, where they should really be working together to try to fix, how do they fix reimbursement, right? How do they fix policy, and how do they work together to drive anesthesia forward? Because both parties are needed moving forward. Now, that's, as an outsider, that's my opinion, right? Really, my my focus is on how do we keep anesthesia sustainable from an economics perspective, right? And how do we service clients better? So it's just my opinion. I think that has been a little lost on the association level. Leaders like yourself have not lost that, right? I mean, that's why you guys are thriving. Both of your businesses are thriving, but I think most business owners would suggest that should be the path forward. So,
yeah, I think you're right, and I not only do I think you're right, most business owners, most department leaders who have like P&L leadership in some form would fall there. I agree with that point, and I agree with the point. That's where our focus should be in terms of, generally I think that the goal of those organizations should be, how do we get things out of the way so that our very esteemed members can do what they're really good at, right? And that's it. That should be the goal, create value in their life. This is an issue, but it doesn't have to be. I don't think, we should do the CRNAs. I don't think they should be doing what PAs are doing and trying to change statute in 50 states. Right. I mean, I think that's kind of like why? And that's where I agree with you, Randy. It's like you're winning everywhere. Like, why waste time on that in that way? Last segment of the show where we just share what is on our mind this week. And actually, I've already touched base because I've been making I'll start and we'll flow to you, Andrew, and then you, Randy, can close out. I've been sharing on TikTok and Instagram this week, and the feedback has been both unexpected and expected. The expected part is you share anything with anesthesia and the normal stuff comes out. And that's an important debate to have, right? I've already talked on the show many times about the distinction between regulatory environment and clinical environment. But largely, it's we've already had that conversation. Can't we talk about something else? And what really occurs to me is how, when I'm sharing these videos, so many young people just want a way to figure out their economic future. And it really makes me think, as a country, we have to figure out how to improve the societal contract so that more and more people feel like they're part of this wealth that we're building. That's one part of my mind. And the other part I've really been thinking about is where America stands in comparison to the rest of the world. Because ultimately, even though things are hard, comparatively, like milk is really expensive, eggs are really expensive. And being a CRNA catapults you into the top 5% of earners in this country. But I still my mom was a nurse and my dad was a teacher growing up. I eventually became a principal. So they were doing better towards the end of my life. But for a large part of my life, we went to bargain grocery stores, right? That's how we lived. And I still shop that way. And I'm doing better financially than I have in the past. So now I get organic eggs and I really splurge. So, these two thoughts are in tension all the time for me. And one way, things are better than they've ever been. I think the version of capitalism we have, and I'll end with this, the version of capitalism we have is not a good one. But I am still sold on the idea that the free enterprise system, when it has good guardrails in place, is still the way to go. It lifts people out of poverty. It allows people like everybody on this call to go out and create value and be rewarded for that value and have a great life. So that's where I'll end it. Andrew, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've been having a lot of conversations recently, and thank you guys for having me on the podcast about some of the conversations we've been having today. And really, I think it's time as an industry for anesthesia specifically to kind of come together on all ends, right? So hospital partners, anesthesiologists, CRNAs, and kind of rethink about how we're looking at the industry and redoing it as a whole. As throughput becomes the focus of surgery, because surgical backlogs are increasing at a unsustainable rate. I think if that doesn't occur and there aren't changes across the board, and the industry isn't unified, we will have to deal with it, whatever those effects are, and be doing a disservice to the people we're trying to provide care for. So that's been one of our focuses. I know there's some people taking a look at it. Some people at MedAction as well we talked to will be looking at putting together a panel to kind of look at some of this stuff as well. So I'm hoping that we could help drive the wave of change here in this.
Isn't MedAction a digital and anesthesia EMR company?
They've trying to build a software to help with coverage problems, but also as part of that,
coverage like anesthesia coverage or coverage like insurance coverage,
predictive scheduling and stuff like that within anesthesia. Sure. And part of what they're trying to take on is more of like an anesthesia economic forum, and I think that will be will provide some value to the overall ecosystem for anesthesia. So
fascinating.
Yeah,
fascinating. You heard it here first.
Yep.
You heard it here first. All right, cool. We'll be interested to see how it comes out. Randy, final word, my friend.
I spend a lot of time thinking about incentives and human behavior. And one of the things that, thinking about what I was going to say today, just how when you see it, you can't stop seeing it, which is like and I'm just as guilty as anyone else, but human behavior has a tendency to default towards tribalism. And I think about myself as an executive in a large anesthesia company. My job is in part to move people away from zero-sum thinking. And so, as an executive in a large company, and I have responsibility of the clinical strategy of the company, which involves all clinicians, is, when trying to snuff out the tribalism that can occur at the site level, between CRNAs and anesthesiologists, and instead build incentives that move us from zero-sum to more collaborative decision-making, and which sounds very theoretical and sort of easy to do, but, and this is one of the things I've learned a lot is it's the Charlie Munger quote, which is show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And a huge amount of what I do is trying to figure out what incentives are driving behavior, current state, and then what incentives do I need to put in place to change those behaviors. And once you start thinking about incentives and acknowledge that incentives drive human behavior, good incentives and bad incentives, and sometimes you use disincentives in order to change bad behavior, then it becomes easier to get people off their tribal kind of zero-sum positioning on a variety of different issues.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This was really good. All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the episode today. We have talked about a whole host of things, which I hope you can tell not a lot of people are talking about in our specialty. I want to invite you, if you have feedback for this episode, you can email us, social@abouttherest.com. We have a website, abouttherest.com. As mentioned during today's episode, I'm on all the social channels, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. I know many of you have noticed the increase in production quality in recent weeks. You can check out Human Content Podcasts. They produce other healthcare creators that you are familiar with. So any feedback, please leave it for us. We are interested. I'm your host, Joe Rodriguez. On the show today, Randall Moore and Andrew Woodmancey. Our executive producers are myself, Aaron Courtney, Rob Goldman, and Shanti Brooke. Our editor and engineer is Andrew Sims. Andrew, welcome to the show. Our music is by Omer Benzavi. To learn about the rest program and ethics policy, submission, verification, and licensing terms, and our HIPAA release terms, you can go to abouttherest.com or reach us at production@abouttherest.com with any questions, concerns, or fun medical puns. Any life advice you want to get, you can email us. About the Rest is a human content production. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.